A Paradox in the Devil's Half Acre by William Tremble. Copyright 2013. William Tremble. Reality is fickle. Not until observing an actual event that finally trumps all of the potential outcomes leading up to that event does reality actually exist. In 1604, Samuel de Champlain sailed into Penobscot Bay, up the Penobscot River, and anchored at the mouth of a stream then known as Cadasquit by the Tarantines, a local Indian tribe. Eventually, the Tarantines and Europeans engaged in fur trading, leading to Jacob Buswell, his wife, and 9 children, from Salisbury, Massachusetts, settling there in 1769. During the next several years, the name of the settlement changed from Cadasquit to Kenduskeag and finally, Kenduskeag. By 1791, approximately 300 settlers decided to incorporate themselves as a town, and since Maine was part of Massachusetts, the settlers had to petition the Massachusetts General Court to become incorporated. The Reverend Seth Noble convinced his neighbors they should call their town Sunbury, and it was decided Reverend Noble would go to Boston to deliver the town's petition. On the 25th of February, 1791, the General Court approved Sunbury for incorporation. Harry and Julie Lambert moved to Sunbury in 1963, when Harry was stationed at Dow Air Force Base as a mechanic keeping the fleet of B-52Gs in the air. When Dow AFB closed in 1968, Harry had put in 10 years with the Air Force, and decided to take a job with an airline that was establishing flights out of Sunbury. He had now been working at the airline for a year. He was 27 years old, and starting a family was not a priority. If it happened, he would go with the flow. If it never happened, he could live with it too. His wife Julie, on the other hand, had become an anxious woman waiting for motherhood, and desperately had been trying to start a family for the past 5 years without any luck. She was born and raised on a farm in Missouri, and came from a big family with 8 kids. She was only 26 years old, but as far as she was concerned she should have already had 2 kids. The sound of her biological clock ticking away consumed her thoughts. As far as she was concerned, she felt like a childless failure. Harry and Julie were dinks, double income, no kids. Harry kept the airline's planes in the sky, and Julie was a registered nurse at St. Joseph Hospital's emergency ward. They had purchased a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house on Garland Street, and they were trying to live the American dream. Unfortunately, not being able to get pregnant was Julie's guilt trip from hell, and for her the dream was more of a nightmare. On a bright sunny day in September of 1978, a 17-year-old girl was brought into the emergency room suffering from a compound fracture of the tibia in her left leg. Julie examined the girl's injury, and seeing the bone protruding through the skin, knew she was going to need surgery to insert a screw into her ankle. Julie asked, "How did you do this?" The girl replied, "I was playing field hockey at Sunbury High. Somebody hit me from the side, down by my ankle. I think they tripped, and fell into me. I didn't see them coming. Once I saw the bone sticking out of my leg, I passed out." Julie continued to ask questions while she took the girl's blood pressure and temperature. "Are you diabetic? Are you a smoker? Are you aware of any heart condition, such as a heart murmur? Are you allergic to any medications? Do you currently have a cold?" The girl answered no to all of the questions until Julie asked, "Do you have the stomach flu?" The girl stopped to think for a moment, and then answered, "Well, I don't know. Most of the time I feel okay, but lately I've been feeling sick to my stomach. Usually I don't eat anything, but that doesn't stop me from throwing up." Julie suspected another problem and asked, "When was your last period?" The girl thought about it for a few seconds, and then answered, "I think it may have been 6 weeks ago." Julie looked at the girl and said, "There is a good chance you are going to need surgery, which means you will be put under anesthesia. The doctor will be in here in a few minutes. Before he comes in, I need to ask you a question. Is there any reason that you may be pregnant?" The girl's face changed from somebody experiencing pain to one of concern. The girl asked her own question, "Pregnant? What do you mean pregnant?" Julie sensed the girl was now very defensive as she realized her encounters with her boyfriend may now have a consequence. Julie said, "Let's take a pregnancy test just to make sure. That way we'll know what we are dealing with." Julie walked out of the examining room to go get a pregnancy test kit. She thought to herself as she was walking down the hallway, "Life sure is unkind. A young girl is horrified that she might be pregnant, while I would do anything to be in her situation." Julie returned to the examination room to find a girl in a panic, verging on a meltdown, after she had a chance to let her situation percolate in her mind. The girl urgently said, "Will my mother find out you're giving me a pregnancy test? She won't be able to handle this. I won't be able to handle this." Julie replied, "Calm down. You might be overreacting. Your mother might surprise you." The girl answered, no, I'm not. My father died in a truck accident a month ago. She is a wreck. She doesn't need this. She doesn't deserve this. She can't find out. Not right now anyway. Julie was faced with a predicament. Should she tell the doctor, or does she give the girl the test without telling him? After deliberating the actions versus consequences, she said, hurry up and take the test. I won't tell the doctor. Only you and I will know. The girl gave Julie a urine sample and Julie left the room to start the test, which would take 2 hours to get the results. When she returned to the examining room, the doctor was in there and said bring her to get some x-rays of the left leg, and call somebody in orthopedics to have them look at the film. Then he turned to the girl and said, let's wait for the x-rays, but it is pretty obvious you are going to need a screw temporarily put into your ankle to hold the bones together. 2 hours later, Julie walked back into the examining room and saw a girl that looked like she was waiting for an executioner to take her to the electric chair. Julie said in a low voice the test came back positive. The girl's face immediately broke into a stream of tears that flowed down her cheeks. Julie said, I understand your mother is coming in to sign the paperwork for the surgery. You need to tell her. You have options that need to be discussed with your mother. This is not the end of the world. Julie's shift was over before the girl's mother arrived at the hospital. The girl made no mention to her mother about her pregnancy. She recovered from the ankle injury and worked at the Tasty Freeze ice cream stand on Union Street as if nothing had changed. She applied ostrich logic. Ignore reality by sticking your head in the sand. That worked until she was beginning to show in the 7th month. Harry and Julie had been running errands, and stopped into Tasty Freeze to get an ice cream sundae. They walked inside the stand and began to read the menu that was above the cash register. There was a group of teenagers whispering amongst themselves as they were looking at the girl taking orders at the counter. Julie could hear them saying, I'm not going to ask her. You ask her. She is. I know she is. Okay, you bunch of chicken shits. I'll ask her. The group of teenagers finally made their way to the counter. Julie could hear giggling, and then one of the teenage girls asked the girl behind the counter, are you pregnant? Stacy says you're pregnant, and that it's Charlie O'Connell's. Julie looked at the girl taking the orders, and realized she was the girl that was treated for the broken ankle. She watched as her face turned red, and her eyes welled up with tears as she ran to the back of the parlor. The group of girls standing at the counter responded, I knew it. I knew she was pregnant. Wait until everybody hears about this. Julie heard enough and said, you girls are horrible, cruel, lowlifes. Then she walked to the back parlor to find the girl blotting her tears with a napkin. Julie asked, do you remember me? I was the nurse that gave you the pregnancy test. The girl nodded her recognition. Julie asked, did you ever tell your mother? The girl shook her head no. Julie wrote on a slip of paper and handed it to the girl as she said, I volunteer my time at a Catholic orphanage in Biddeford to do physicals. It is run by nuns and they help girls in your situation. You need to talk to your mother about this. If you are not going to keep the baby, this orphanage can help out. Dart. It was June 1979. The phone rang at 7 p.m., and Julie picked it up. Harry was watching the news, but knew something was being said to Julie to give her a shocked look. She hung the phone and Harry asked who was the. Julie looked at Harry in a daze and then answered as she became choked up with emotion, that was St. Anthony's Orphanage in Biddeford. The sister on the phone said, our application has been processed and that they have a little baby boy available for us. Oh my God, is this really happening? Dart. It was late spring of 2015. Jack Lambert was a 34-year-old account manager for Pinnacle Incorporated, Maine's largest advertising agency located in Sunbury. He was on his way to visit a new client that was looking to increase their revenues. Jack had a scheduled meeting with Chase Harper, the CEO of Horizons, to better understand what Horizons offered its clients and to define the statement of work to be performed by Pinnacle. After parking his Lexus on State Street, Jack walked into Horizons facilities, which were located just down the street from Maine General Hospital. It was a modern-looking brick office building with large mirror windows. The first floor contained offices, while the second floor was reserved for client training. Jack was escorted to a conference room by the 20-something-year-old woman that manned the front desk. Jack sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes until the door opened, revealing a man that looked like he came directly from the 1960s. The man was bald on top, but had a long grey ponytail growing from the back of his head. He looked to be about 50 years old, wearing a black t-shirt, blue jeans, and sandals. He was followed by a slim woman of Asian descent wearing loose-fitting pants, sneakers, and a t-shirt that did not have sleeves, revealing a slight muscular build that was wiry and not brawny. Jack stood up to meet his new clients. The man with a ponytail stuck his hand out and said, nice to meet you, Jack. I'm Chase Harper and this is my operations leader, T. Jack replied, nice to meet you both. Then he looked at the Asian woman named T and said, T, Is that short for anything? T answered with a slight laugh. No, it isn't. My last name is Time, and every time Chase introduces me using my last name, people get confused. They hear tea time and think we are going golfing. Jack smiled and said, yes, I can see how that could be confusing. Well, I wanted to meet you both so that I could see your operation here and to give you an opportunity to ask me questions so that we can focus on the things that need to be a priority. Chase answered, then let me begin. Jack listened to Chase as he spoke for the next 15 minutes talking about Horizon's current customer base and service offerings. Horizons was a consulting group that focused on corporations that needed training involving business processes such as purchasing, project management, inventory, and personnel management. The personnel management included training managers to avoid legal problems and assisting with resolving work-life issues by offering counseling to a corporation's employees that are experiencing personal stress. Jack toured the facilities with Chase and T and then said, I would like to take you both to lunch. How does that sound? Chase replied, I have a previous engagement, so I'm sorry to say that I cannot go to lunch, but I believe T is available. Jack looked at T and said, great, T, I parked just out front. Shall we go after a 20-minute drive? Jack and T arrived at his favorite restaurant that overlooked the river and they were soon sitting at a table ordering drinks and lunch. Once the waitress came with the drinks, Jack looked at T and raised his glass of scotch and said, to Happy Horizons. Once he took a drink and put his glass down on the table, he asked his first question. I can get my head around the operational business consulting side of Horizons. But what problems are you running into on the personnel management side? T answered, the biggest problem is making our clients realize that they have risks that have hidden costs that if ignored, don't stay hidden long. Jack replied, what do you mean? T replied, most of our clients have a workforce that is increasingly under stress from the economy. Their job, their kids, extended family, or their second job to pay the bills. We are finding that employees are as loyal as employers, meaning there is no loyalty, and people often leave jobs for a multitude of reasons. We need to mitigate the unwanted employee attrition. That attrition is costing money from the loss of efficiency of a knowledgeable workforce, and training their replacements. Our clients are recreating the wheel each time an employee leaves. Jack listened to T for the next few minutes as she talked about the corporate training of employees to teach techniques to avoid anxiety and stress. Jack thought to himself, this sounds like a bunch of mumbo-jumbo bullshit. T looked at Jack and said, you are not buying any of this, are you? Jack was thrown off guard by that comment and replied, touchy-feely are two words that have never been used to describe me. But if there are cost savings, then they need to be brought out and highlighted. T replied, cost savings is a misnomer. It really is cost avoidance. We had a client that had unhappy employees. They were underpaid, overworked, and treated poorly. They couldn't keep their experienced employees long enough to turn a steady profit. Finally, one of their employees snapped and went postal. He came to work with a pistol and enough ammunition clips to kill the 3 people that caused his pain. Sadly, he also critically wounded 15 other people, turning some of them into paraplegics or vegetables lying in a coma. The cost to that company and the employees was immeasurable. The company filed bankruptcy and we were called in to assist the new management. We did an analysis of the local workforce and compensation requirements. We recommended a pay scale that was not the lowest, but rather the fairest to the employees, while allowing the corporation to be profitable. We also trained the shit out of their managers, showing them how to deal effectively with people. So I guess that's what we need you to focus on. We need you to highlight and show the benefits to a company when it spends money on its employees. It all sounds counterintuitive, but in this case spending money saves money. Jack listened to T and then asked, what did you major in when you went to college? T replied, I majored in mechanical engineering with a minor in psychology. I guess I just like to understand what made things tick, both with man and machine. I had a psychology professor that gave an award out at the end of the year. It was a gold-plated pacifier attached to a plaque, and he said that I was the perfect person to receive the award because I fully understood the man-machine interface. He handed me the award and said, I trust you know what end to stick it in. I answered that would depend on the particular needs of the situation. The second glass of scotch loosened Jack up and he laughed heartily at T's last comment. He liked T. She was smart, to the point, and most importantly she was good looking. The conversation took a slightly altered course when T started talking about a psychology research project she helped perform back in college. T was talking about the wellness training to reduce anxiety and stress that Horizons offered to their clients. If you think some of this training is touchy, touchy-feely than you wouldn't believe the psychology research I was involved in when I was at UCLA. Jack asked, you went to UCLA. Are you from California? T answered, my parents emigrated here from Taiwan in 1976 and they moved to Silicon Valley. Both of my parents worked at Apple. I was born in San Jose 5 years later. Where did you grow up and where did you go to school? Jack answered, that's a good question. I was adopted as a baby. It was a sealed adoption, so I don't know anything about my birth mother. My adoptive parents raised me right here in Sunbury. After high school I went into the Air Force for 5 years, and then I graduated from the University of Connecticut majoring in accounting and finance, but I also took a lot of marketing courses to fill in the credit requirements, so I guess I could say I could have been a tax accountant who could have sold a line of bull to the IRS. T asked, did you ever look for your birth mother? Jack replied, no, the only parents I ever knew were the ones from my first memories. As far as I'm concerned, they are my birth parents. Jack believed this, but ever since his parents told him he was adopted when he was 9 years old, there was something unanswered. Where did he come from and what were the circumstances causing the adoption? Not knowing the answers was an itch that he couldn't scratch. Jack continued, after college I bounced around taking jobs in Massachusetts and Connecticut, but the gravitational force in Maine is a strong one. So here I am back in Sunbury where I get my cake and can eat it too. Then he wanted to stop talking about himself to avoid having to talk about painful events in his life and asked, what kind of psychology research did you do? T replied, it touched on the non-scientific aspects of quantum mechanics. We were Einsteins. Most of the people on the research team would have had difficulty balancing their checkbook. The main focus was to gain a better understanding of consciousness. If touchy-feely isn't in your vocabulary, then I doubt if she squishy is either. We tried to measure whether changes made to our consciousness had any effect on our reality. In other words, did positive thoughts have a positive impact on reality? Could we measurably detect an effect on future events affecting reality? Jack asked, did you find any effect? He replied, our sample size was limited to 600 people, mostly coming from the UCLA campus, which was statistically large enough to draw conclusions, but small enough to create some doubt, especially when the sample came from the same location like a university. We did find a correlation. There seemed to be people in the sample that had good things happen when they thought about good things happening to them. Another interesting thing we found was, regardless of whether positive thoughts evoked a positive event, people generally felt better about their situation. I have read and watched videos over the years about a thing they call the law of attraction. It is pretty new wave stuff. A touchy-feely guy like you probably wouldn't go for it. Basically, it's like the movie Field of Dreams. If you build it, he will come. Positive thoughts create positive actions and events. Reality is all energy, and that energy can be either positive or negative. Concentrating on positive thoughts will attract positive events to your reality. Jack smiled and shook his head and asked, do you really believe this? T answered, Jack, honestly, I don't know what to think, but I do know there are people desperately trying to explain the unexplainable. Just remember 800 years ago smart people thought the world was flat, and the sun orbited around the earth. If you traveled too far out to sea, you would sail off the edge of the world. I think that's what's going on now. We are just kicking the tires of this thing they call quantum mechanics. The Big Bang, the universe, the multiverse with 11 dimensions, string theory. We are grasping at straws trying to find an answer. I think the answer will be a simple one that explains a complicated reality. I mean, just look at the universe, the vastness, and the subatomic, all contained in our reality. Our problem is defining reality, and when you have questions about what you should know is reality, I think anything is possible. Jack replied, T, you are a complex individual. Then he looked at his watch and said, are we all set here? We got to get back to the coal mine to dig our 16 tons. For the next month, Jack worked up an advertising campaign for Horizons that targeted Boston and eastern Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. He also developed a friendship with T that went past the line of a casual work relationship. 2 months later, Jack was assigned the bicentennial advertising campaign for the city of Sunbury that would soon be celebrating its 200th anniversary. Jack had already met with the city manager of Sunbury and the chairman of the bicentennial committee. The ad campaign was scoped out to utilize print and television media. He was currently working on a video that would be called The Evolution of Sunbury, which would provide a pictorial look back using artwork and old photographs of important events and places. The video would also highlight Sunbury's positive aspects for attracting new businesses. He was putting in 12-hour days looking over archival photographs from the Sunbury Historical Society. He had a headache and rubbed his eyes and temples, saying to himself, I sure as hell wish I had a production assistant that could pull this raw data together, but that will only happen when monkeys fly out my ass. The old historical photographs he stared at all day had no meaning or connection to him. They were just old pictures of women wearing long dresses and big hats, men wearing three-piece suits and small derby hats, all frozen in time, blankly staring back at him. Many of the buildings had been torn down over the years due to urban development that cannibalized Sunbury in the 1960s. Jack used a website called whatwasthere.com where old photographs of Sunbury could be superimposed over current images from Google Maps Street View. Strangely, Jack started to see a connection from the past to the present day when the old photographs were overlaid on top of the Google Maps Street View image. The old black and white photographs of sailing ships that sailed away long ago, along with horse carriages and trolley cars, began to come alive with color, instantly washing away the years. Jack made both the old photo and the Google photo to both appear in the same image by making them both semi-transparent. He stared at the image, saying to himself, the past meets the present. Look at that, it's like they share the same time and space. I can see the past is part of the present. It was a Wednesday evening at 11 p.m. when he finally got home from work. He made a quick sandwich and a glass of iced tea and sat down and watched the late local news and the first 15 minutes of The Tonight Show before going to bed. He set his alarm for 6:30 a.m. to start it all over again. For some reason, when his head hit the pillow, he thought about the overlaid images, and eventually his mind wandered as he drifted off to sleep with his last thoughts connecting the past with the present. It was a bright sunny day that followed a day of rain. The air was thick with moisture as the sunshine started to evaporate the puddles that were left over from the rainstorm. Jack knew he was walking the streets of Sunbury, but they were only remotely familiar. The streets were not paved, and were muddy and rutted. There was a raw smell in the air that primarily came from the smell of horse manure that spotted the streets. The buildings were unfamiliar, but he knew he was walking through West Market Square following the Kenduskeag River where it converged with the Penobscot River. He aimlessly walked the streets staring at the vaguely familiar buildings, and eventually found himself walking into a saloon on what he knew to be Broad Street. As he entered, it took a moment for his eyes to adjust from the sunlight to the darkness of the saloon, but eventually he saw a long bar with a few empty wooden stools inviting him to sit down. A bartender came over and said, "What's your pleasure?" Jack suddenly was confronted with a question and realized he had no clue what he wanted, or why he was there. He wasn't even sure how he had gotten there. He patted his chest and pockets looking for an answer, but could only come up with a confused look. He answered the bartender, I don't know." The bartender thought he was a drunk and angrily replied, "Well, chummy, I don't know either, but until you do, why don't you take your ass back out on the street where you can look for it?" Jack heard another voice give the man a kind, "And while you are at it, why don't you give me one too?" The man was wearing a dark three-piece suit that had a strong sour smell of body odor, as did most of the people that crossed Jack's path. He stuck out his hand and said, "My name is Seamus O'Malley, and who do I have the pleasure of imbibing God's most heavenly drink with?" Jack saw the barkeep turn and start pouring 2 pints of beer that eventually made it to Jack and the man named Seamus. Jack had not acknowledged Seamus's hand or the pint of beer sitting in front of him. Then he heard the Irishman say, "Why don't you take a haul off your beer first? Maybe that will loosen the thoughts in your head and allow one of them to spill out of your mouth." Jack looked at Seamus and realized following somebody's suggestion made more sense than sitting at the bar in a state of confusion. He reached down and grabbed the pint and hesitantly took a sip. The pint of beer was only slightly cooler than room temperature, and it had a strong taste like drinking rye bread. Jack felt the beer quench his dry throat, making him want to take a second drink from the pint glass. Then he turned to Seamus and held out his hand, saying, "Thank you for the pint. My name is Jack Lambert." Seamus shook his hand while grinning and said, "Looks like the logjam of thoughts in your head is starting to move. Where are you from? You have the hands of somebody that uses his brain and not his back." Jack hesitated before answering as he was trying to formulate a response, but realized his conclusion made no sense. He then answered, "I'm from Sunbury, but it has changed a bit since I was here last." Seamus took a drink from his beer, and then put the glass down, turning his head to look at Jack and asked, "What brings you back to Sunbury?" Jack replied the truth. "I don't know what brought me here, but here I am." Jack did a double take when he saw a pig standing in the back room and asked, "What is the pig doing here?" Seamus chuckled and then said, "You sure have been away a long time if you don't know why there is a pig in the back room." Jack replied to each. Seamus answered, "No, that would be Captain Pokey the pig. He is the reason you can drink whiskey and beer in this fine establishment. See, Maine is the only foolish state in this great union that makes it illegal to enjoy alcohol, unless of course it's for medical purposes." Pokey the pig is a blind pig, and that my friend is a curiosity that people are willing to pay to see. It is also a curiosity that makes people thirsty. So while they are here to pay to feast their eyes on Pokey the pig, they can enjoy free refreshments such as whiskey and beer. The government lawmen get bamboozled every time they try to close us down. But Pokey keeps us drinking. Jack replied, now where I came from that's what we call getting off on a technicality. Seamus replied, where I come from that's just what we call getting off. Seamus was going to ask Jack another question and began to speak up. Where are you? Seamus stopped talking mid-sentence when he saw Jack disappear into thin air right in front of his eyes. Seamus blankly stared at the empty stool, and then whispered, holy sweet Jesus dart. Jack was sound asleep, deep into a dream when his alarm clock started to wail, waking him from his troubled slumber. He instinctively slammed his hand on top of the clock to silence the alarm. A minute later he was sitting on the edge of his bed saying to himself, Jesus, it feels like I was up all night long. What the hell kind of dream was that? It took Jack only 20 minutes to get ready for work as he took a 1-minute shower, threw on his clothes, and grabbed the Pop-Tart on his way out the door. As he drove to work, his dream from the previous night began to monopolize his thoughts, making him talk to himself. That dream seemed so real. It was Sunbury. The roads and streets were laid out the same way, but many of the buildings were different. The roads were dirt, horse carriages were everywhere, and people were dressed in long dresses and suits. They were dressed like it was 100 years ago. Why did I have a dream about Sunbury 100 years ago? It must be my mind playing games. All of the old photos I've been looking at. What was the Irishman's name? Seamus. Seamus what? Seamus O'Malley. Who the fuck is Seamus O'Malley, and why should I care? Dart. Jack worked all morning on the Sunbury Bicentennial media package. It was now 11:30 in the morning and his stomach was rumbling. He picked up the phone and called a number he had become very familiar with, and waited for an answer on the other end of the call when he said, hi T, what are you doing for lunch? I was thinking of bisbees. Are you up for it? T answered, only if you let me buy. You picked up the last lunch. Now it's my turn. By the time 12:30 p.m. rolled around, Jack and T were at Bisbee's waiting for their lunch to arrive. Jack began to talk about his dream and rehashed the conversation he had with himself on the ride into work. Why would I have such a detailed dream about Sunbury, especially when it was Sunbury from probably around 1900, and there was the Irishman named Seamus O'Malley? Where did the name come from? T pulled out her smartphone and said, I don't know. Let's see what Google has to say about Seamus O'Malley. Jack watched as T's thumbs quickly typed on her smartphone, and then she looked up and said Seamus O'Malley was indeed a real person. It says here he was the county sheriff. This says he was being impeached because the governor at the time said Maine had been trying unsuccessfully to enforce its first-in-the-nation prohibition law for more than 50 years. Nothing seemed to work in places like Sunbury, not even a constitutional amendment or an army of state liquor detectives. The first target in this crackdown was County Sheriff Seamus O'Malley. O'Malley's impeachment trial began on the 10th of April, 1913 before members of the state legislature, which resulted from a willful and corrupt neglect to enforce the prohibitory law. The prosecutor summed up the state's case by saying no attempt was made to hide the sale of liquor. Saloons were separated from the streets only by doors, and when the doors were open in warm weather, anyone could look in and see men drinking and rows of bottles behind the bars. If Sheriff O'Malley had made a decent effort to change things, the Attorney General would have given him more time to clean up the city. O'Malley ran a popular establishment down on Broad Street, an area characterized as the Devil's Half Acre, at the foot of Broad Street. Jack was floored when T said he was a real person. He racked his brain to see if there was any recognition given to the name Seamus O'Malley and said, I have no memory of ever hearing that name. T replied, you probably read it somewhere during the past week and just forgot about it. Jack understood what T meant, but he still had his doubts. Remembering faces and names was something somebody in marketing and sales did every day. He knew in his gut that something was going on, but that was a mystery to be solved on another day. That afternoon Jack went to the Sunbury Public Library to see what facts and figures he could dig up to include in the bicentennial video. He was lucky enough to find a librarian that was very knowledgeable in Sunbury history. He spent the next 4 hours looking at newspaper articles written about the Devil's Half Acre during the years of its heyday, 1875 through 1910. He read about various mayors and notable events such as the New Year's Day fire that broke out on Broad Street at 8 a.m. and burned down a business establishment that was known to serve whiskey. According to the newspaper article, John McInnes, a drunken patron, had been thrown out of a tavern just as the sun rose on the new year. He stumbled into an alleyway behind the tavern and lit a pile of scrap wood to keep warm. The fire created sparks that caused the tavern fire. Jack wondered if that was the bar he had wandered into. Jack kept reading microfilm when he saw a headline titled Sheriff O'Malley Grieves and began reading the article. Shannon O'Malley, age 11, the youngest daughter of Sheriff Seamus O'Malley, fell through the ice of a local pond at the Jamieson farm located out on Broadway. Shannon O'Malley and a group of friends from school went ice skating on Saturday, another warm day in the recent January thaw that Sunbury has been experiencing. It took a half hour to retrieve Shannon from the pond's frigid water. Sadly, she had already drowned. Jack read the date of the paper, the 15th of January, 1911, then sat there silently at the microfilm reader with a feeling that something was amiss. He sat there for a long while trying to understand why he felt this way, and finally decided it was time to go home at a sensible hour. He was exhausted and it didn't take long for him to fall asleep that night. Once his head hit his bed pillow, he was asleep as if he knocked himself out hitting a big rock. Instead of a pillow, Jack found himself walking down the street that paralleled the Penobscot River. He believed it to be Washington Street because of its location, not because he recognized any of the buildings that had long since been torn down from his future. He kept walking and found himself on Broad Street, where he managed to find the same bar that he stumbled upon on his previous visit. Jack walked into the bar that had 20 men smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, and playing cards. They looked like a ragtag group that must have been deckhands on ships that came up the Penobscot to Sunbury. Jack was dressed in khaki pants, loafers, and a blue striped white shirt that got the attention of the clientele that stared at him like he was a monkey on parade. Jack ignored their glances and walked up to the bartender and asked, "I'd like to speak with Seamus O'Malley. Is he here?" The bartender suspiciously looked at Jack wearing his strange clothes and said, "Maybe." "Who's asking?" Jack replied, "An acquaintance that has information he needs to know." The bartender disappeared into a back room for a minute and then reappeared with Seamus O'Malley, who walked up and said, "Who are you? And what information do you have that I need to know, that is so important, that you interrupted my card game?" Jack was surprised that Seamus did not recognize him, and began to wonder whether this visit came before his last visit in Seamus's timeline. Jack said, "Don't you remember me?" Seamus stared at Jack, trying to place his face, and then Jack could see recognition in his eyes, prompting him to say, "You were here a few weeks ago, weren't you?" Jack nodded affirmatively and said, "That's right." Seamus replied, "And you disappeared right into thin air as I was talking to you, just like a puff of smoke. You were gone." Back in Dublin they would call that fairy magic, or maybe the little people were playing tricks on me. But we aren't in the old country now, are we? Who are you? Or maybe I should say, what are you? Jack answered, "I'm a man same as you. Is there a place we can speak in private?" Seamus replied, "Hold your britches, I'll be right back." Jack watched as Seamus walked over to the bartender and said something, and then he returned saying, "Follow me." Jack followed Seamus into the back room that had 4 men sitting at a table playing cards, drinking whiskey. Jack could hear the door close behind him, and then felt hands grabbing both of his arms when he said, "What the fuck is this? I thought you wanted to know what I had to say." Seamus answered, "But I do. It will just be under my terms." Jack could hear somebody fumbling with something large and heavy from a closet. Jack looked at what they were bringing out and was confused. It looked like a large cage in the shape of a chair. Seamus said, "Put him in the tramp chair." Jack could hear the flat metal bands clang and squeak as they were being manipulated. Then Jack was pulled backwards into the tramp chair contraption. It took 30 seconds for his handlers to close the door, locking him into his personally sized jail cell. Seamus walked up to the tramp chair and said, "I hope you have something important to say, otherwise the chair will become your personal birdcage." Jack said the first thing that came into his mind, "You are going to be sheriff." Seamus sarcastically looked at the other men in the room and said, "Oh sweet Jesus, we're in the presence of a great oracle who just told the sheriff that he is going to be sheriff. What other fantastic predictions do you have for me?" Jack was processing this information and asked, "What year is it? What's the date?" Seamus turned to his audience again and said he doesn't even know the year or date. "I am about out of patience. I certainly hope you have something more to say before you find yourself waking up on a sailing ship." Jack looked Seamus directly in the eye and said, "Your daughter Shannon is going to die. Now tell me the fucking date." Seamus heard his daughter's name and what he interpreted as a threat and said, "Now sonny boy, you just might end up dead next to the railroad tracks." Jack said again, "What's the fucking date?" Seamus glared at Jack for a moment and then said, "The 14th of October, 1910. Jack replied, "Good. Your daughter Shannon is in the 4th grade and will go ice skating on the pond at the Jamieson farm located out on Broadway. The date will be the 15th of January, 1911. You must stop her from going ice skating. She fell through the ice and drowned. Even if you don't believe me, Don't let her go ice skating. And one other thing, this bar that we're in right now will burn to the ground on the 1st of January, 1911. A fire will be lit by a drunk that you threw out at 8 in the morning. His name was John McInnes. He was thrown out into the cold and he started a fire to keep warm, burning some scrap wood in the back alley. Sparks from the fire burned this place to the ground. The 7 men in the back room listened to Jack's predictions, and then saw him disappear into nothingness while he was sitting in the tramp chair. Jack woke from his sleep to the sound of a large firecracker being lit off in his neighborhood. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, so Jack got up to start the day. He walked out into the kitchen and made a bowl of cereal. He had made copies of the microfilm articles from the newspaper, and they were sitting on his kitchen table where he had left them the previous night. Jack picked one of the copies of the 1st of January, 1911 Sunbury commercial newspaper and noticed it had changed. There was an article with the headline "Sheriff O'Malley averts disaster." The article read, "Sheriff Seamus O'Malley alertly detected and extinguished a fire that had been set in the alleyway between buildings on Lower Broad Street. Sheriff Seamus O'Malley also single-handedly subdued the culprit lighting the fire that was identified as a Mr. John McInnes, a Boston and Maine Railroad hand. Sheriff O'Malley is currently holding McInnes in the Sunbury jail." Jack started to recall his dream from the previous night, and then remembered the 15th of January, 1911 article detailing Shannon O'Malley's drowning. He looked for the other article and also found that article had changed. The article now was headlined "Sheriff O'Malley bravely saves children from certain death." For the second time this month, Sheriff O'Malley saves lives. Yesterday, Sheriff O'Malley escorted a group of 8 schoolgirls to the pond on the Jamison farm on Outer Broadway. According to Sheriff O'Malley, "Once I heard the girls were going ice skating, I feared there would be a problem because of the warm weather we've been having. I knew that if I kept my daughter Shannon home, the other girls would still go and be in danger. So I decided to go to make sure they were safe, and it's a good thing I did." Norris Jamison relayed what he saw. "I see a wagon show up to my farm with 8 schoolgirls. They piled off the wagon and followed a man carrying a long staff. By gosh, if he didn't look like a shepherd leading sheep." Well, all the girls commenced putting on their skates and started out onto the ice. It didn't take long for somebody to break through the pond's ice and land in the icy water. Then I see Sheriff O'Malley charge out onto the pond with his long staff that had a hook on the end of it. He thrust the hooked staff into the water and pulled out one of the schoolgirls like it was the catch of the day. And lo and behold, wouldn't you know it, it was his own daughter Shannon that he saved from that icy death. Jack said to himself, "Looks like Seamus listened to me. And it looks like he milked it for all of the good publicity he could get out of it. This can't be happening. This is just too fucking weird." Later that morning, Delia Sullivan, his production assistant, came into his office and said, "Jack, I proofread your notes and draft script for the bicentennial video, and I created a movie maker video file so you can pull it into the final version. I was just wondering why you didn't mention the Great Sunbury Fire. That was probably one of the biggest events during the last 100 years. Jack replied, "What do you mean? What great fire? I've been at the library all week going through microfilm and there was no mention of it." His assistant replied, "I think it was in April of 1911. I think the 30th of April was the exact date. It damn near burned down half the city." Jack sat there for a moment, then said, "Well, I'd better get back to the library to get the details." Jack began to wonder if his dreams were somehow changing history. Tea came over to Jack's condo for dinner. It was a Friday night and they decided to stay in and grill steaks, drink margaritas, and watch movies that had just come out on his cable company's on-demand menu. During dinner, Jack brought up his last dream and its effect on history and current-day reality. Jack asked T, "You have been made aware of my dreams, and now there is a timeline that includes Sunbury's Great Fire of 1911. Let me ask you, when did you first become aware of Sunbury's Great Fire?" T replied, "I'm not from around here, so local history is not something I am well versed in, but I would have to say I've heard about it a few years ago." Jack was surprised by that answer and said, "I don't know why I did not find any information about the fire when I was at the library. I swear there was no information." T replied, "I remember the conversation about Seamus O'Malley, but I don't have any recollection of talking to you about a fire in Sunbury. I do have a recollection of something they call the Great Fire that happened around 1911, but I knew about that a few years ago." Jack replied, "I went back to the library after Delia Sullivan told me that I was missing the Sunbury Great Fire. The library was full of newspaper microfilm detailing the fire that burned half the city. There is no way that I missed the volume of those articles on microfilm. The Sunbury commercial newspaper wrote an article about the fire a month after it occurred that summarized everything." Jack pulled out a copy of the article and began reading, and they said it was the worst disaster to ever strike Sunbury. It burned 55 acres, destroyed 267 buildings, damaged 100 more, and destroyed more than 100 businesses during a 9-hour span, which caused over $3 million in losses. It also left 75 families homeless. On Sunday, the 30th of April, 1911, about 4 p.m. the alarm sounded after a fire was spotted in a hay shed owned by J. Frank Green at 176 Broad Street, on the west bank of the Kenduskeag stream. The fire spread quickly through the wooden buildings. The embers from the hay shed ignited the coal sheds at Bacon and Robinson, and eventually a strong wind carried them over the Kenduskeag stream to the other areas of the city. After he finished reading the article, he said, "You must think I'm losing it. Me talking about history being changed because I told somebody in my dream that lived over 100 years ago, and they changed the events. And now, as far as the world is concerned, the previous timeline never existed. I have to tell you, just listening to that statement makes me think I'm crazy, but I know I'm not." T replied, "Well, the next time you're in one of these dreams, leave something behind that proves you were there. Maybe carve your initials into a tree, rock, or building. That will give you solid proof that you were actually there over 100 years ago." Jack answered, "Good idea. That's what I like about you, T. You're always thinking. Delia Sullivan and Jack watched the first cut of the Sunbury Bicentennial video. Jack clicked on the video file saved on his laptop, and the connected projector created a large projection against a white wall in his office. The video was 45 minutes long, but Jack saw edits that would cut the video down to the required 30-minute runtime. Once they finished watching the video, Jack asked, "So what do you think about the video?" Delia replied, "I liked it. It hit the 3 L's. Jack asked, "3 L's?" Delia smiled and said, "Logging, lumber, and lobster," but it also had shipbuilding, egg harvesting, and making bricks. "Oh yeah, I see you mentioned the Devil's Half Acre and my great-grandfather." Jack replied, "No kidding. Your great-grandfather?" Delia answered, "That's right, the Honorable Sheriff Seamus O'Malley." Jack sat there stunned by that coincidence, which he believed probably was not a coincidence. Jack said in a low voice, "Who would ever think Seamus O'Malley's granddaughter is right here staring me in the face? Unbelievable." "Who was your grandmother?" Delia replied, "My grandmother was Shannon O'Malley, Seamus's daughter. She married John Sullivan, and they had 4 boys that included my father, Daniel Sullivan." Jack asked, "Do you have any stories about your great-grandfather Seamus?" "Based on what I've read, he lived an interesting life." Delia replied, "He lived in interesting times. You may have already guessed that he ran a bar, saloon, or a place where anybody could find trouble if they were looking for it. When he was sheriff, he still controlled his corner of Broad Street right in the middle of the Devil's Half Acre. In fact, this office building is at the same corner of Broad and Water Streets that my great-grandfather had his saloon. Now that is one heck of a coincidence. You could say that he learned how to walk a tightrope between breaking the law and being the law. Everybody always said he knew what was going on in his corner of the acre. My grandmother said Seamus was a misunderstood soul. She always said there are people that are diamonds in the rough, and then there was her father Seamus, who was the rough in a diamond. I do remember an old story my grandmother swears is true. She said my great-grandfather was visited by a stranger that came into his saloon and told him when and where my grandmother was going to drown by falling through the ice when she went ice skating with classmates. Then the stranger disappeared into thin air right in front of his eyes. Other people were there and saw this happen." Jack sat there silently and thought, how fucked up is that? Delia would shit if I told her I was the stranger. Jack and T were sitting in the sand at Acadia National Park's sand beach. Jack had just come back to the blanket after swimming for 15 minutes in the Atlantic's 55-degree temperature. It was refreshing to say the least, but was probably closer to hypothermia. Jack let the sunshine warm his bones for a while when he began to think about Delia Sullivan's relationship to Seamus and Shannon O'Malley. T said, "Jack, put on some sunscreen. It looks like you are burning." Jack replied as he smeared lotion on his torso. "I always wondered if I was part Eskimo because I can get a burn under a full moon." Then he said, "You'll never guess what I found out yesterday." T replied, "Coming from you, it could be anything." Jack continued, "Earlier in the week, after Delia Sullivan pointed out that I missed including the Great Fire of Sunbury in the video, I went back to the library to try to get details. Newspaper accounts said the fire started on Broad Street and the April winds from the south carried the cinders across the Kenduskeag stream to the center of town where it burned flat. It was reported to have been started by a careless match thrown in a hay barn by a man named John McInnes. That is the same person I told Seamus O'Malley to watch out for on New Year's Day, 1911, who would start a fire on Broad Street burning scrap wood." Well, it looks like the fire was avoided on New Year's Day, but it came back with a vengeance on the 30th of April, 1911. I found out some other interesting information. Delia Sullivan is the granddaughter of Shannon O'Malley. Can you believe that? What are the chances of that happening? I just can't get my head around what is going on. T answered, sit back and just listen to the waves. Sometimes answers reveal themselves when you are not looking for them. Jack stretched out on the blanket facing the blue sky as he brought his Red Sox baseball cap down over his eyes to block the sun. Then he listened to the rhythm of the waves as they washed him to dreamland. Jack found himself standing just outside Sunbury's Thomas Hill Standpipe, the 110-foot water tower that was 225 feet above sea level. The water tower was a steel structure encased in a wooden shell that contained the stairwell that wrapped around the steel structure between the steel structure and wooden shell. Jack looked up at the top of the standpipe and decided to walk up the stairwell. Once Jack reached the top of standpipe, he walked around the promenade that looked out in every direction. He saw a maze of dirt roads, the city of Sunbury in the distance, and the tops of sailing ship masts in the Penobscot River. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a jackknife and opened it up, revealing a 2-inch blade. He walked over to one of the 24 support beams that were 12 inches in diameter. He chose a spot that was hidden from view and began carving his initials and his cell phone number, JL207-555-3355. Once he was finished, Jack closed the jackknife and admired his message to the future, and then he made his way back down the stairs to the road. He began walking in the direction of the center of Sunbury. Jack woke up to the urgent yell, "Watch out!" Then he felt sand kicked in his direction as an errant frisbee landed nearby. Jack sat up and realized he had fallen asleep, and it was now 4 in the afternoon. He watched T standing in the water where the waves broke against her shins. He looked around and realized he wasn't the only one watching T in her bikini. After a few minutes, she returned to the blanket and sat down, saying, "You were sound asleep, hopefully solving all the world's problems." Jack remembered going to the standpipe and carving his initials and cell phone number into one of the beams. Then he asked, "Have you had enough of the beach?" T answered, "You can never get enough of the beach, but I am getting a little hungry. If you are ready to go, I'm ready to go." Jack said, "Okay, let's stop at the Lobster Pound in Trenton on the way home." On their trip back to Sunbury, Jack told T about his dream of going to the top of the standpipe where he carved his initials and cell phone number. T replied, "The plot thickens. You better call me as soon as you find out if those initials are still there." Dart. The following Monday, Jack called the chairman of the Bicentennial Committee and arranged a tour of the Thomas Hill Standpipe. At 3 p.m. Jack met Sunbury's head of public works at the Thomas Hill Standpipe with his camera in hand. Jack walked around and snapped shots of the outside of the standpipe, and then they walked up to the top of the standpipe and walked around the promenade. He took many pictures of the view from the promenade, and then he walked over to where he carved his initials and cell phone number into the beam during his dream. He zoomed the camera in on the area and snapped 3 shots without a flash and 3 shots with a flash. Then he looked at his public works tour guide and said, "Thank you, the shots are exactly what I needed to finish the video. I think I've bothered you long enough." Jack hurried back to the office and put the camera's memory disk into his laptop, where he quickly viewed the photos he took of the beam. It was painted over a few times, but he managed to enhance photographs so he can see indentations that showed his initials and cell phone number under years of paint being applied. Jack sat back in his chair and said to himself, "Holy shit, there is no doubt now. I was there and carved those letters and numbers." Jack and T had dinner that evening in downtown Sunbury and then went for a walk along the sidewalk that followed the Penobscot River. Jack looked at T and said, "You have read about quantum mechanics. Is there anything you have read that might explain what is going on?" T replied. Jack, "I've read some articles in quantum mechanics, which means that I am probably dangerous when it comes to explaining anything. One thing comes to mind though. Quantum mechanics seems to have everything intertwined. Things seem to be related or connected when there is no logical reason for that to occur. They call it quantum entanglement. Scientists have proved that when 2 particles that are entangled, say 2 electrons, when one electron spins to the left, the other entangled electron also simultaneously spins to the left. And if you separate these 2 electrons by great distances, say 1 million miles or maybe even a light year, that relationship stays the same. The entangled electrons spin instantaneously with each other even if it's at distances of millions of miles. At the distance apart, the signal to spin, traveling at the speed of light, would not be fast enough to send the information between the electrons to make them simultaneously turn." Jack asked, "So you're saying that somehow I'm connected with the past even though that's a distance too great, like the entangled electrons responding to each other at great distances?" T replied, "We think of time as going in one direction, the past, the present, and the future. I don't think time is sequential. I think the past is still there. We're in the present, and there is many potential futures all at the same time. You are in the present, and went back and changed the past, which then also changed the future. I can see why quantum physicists believe there are multiple dimensions and universes. Jack thought a minute about T's last statement, and then spoke slowly as he was struggling to pull together a coherent thought. It makes sense if I think of it like this. Let's say the past, present, future all have the same moment in time referred to as now. A changed now will also simultaneously change the past, present, and the future. It's kind of like dropping a pebble into a pond. The now is the pebble and it creates a circular ripple that changes the past, and the ripple also changes the future, all during the same now. The more I think about it, the ripple would not just travel along the surface of the water, it would also broadcast a ripple out in all directions like an expanding sphere. Maybe that's where they get the 11 dimensions from. Reality is where all potential outcomes are consolidated into one event in the now, and then that single now event also affects the past and the future. Why do I feel like a pollywog crawling out of the mud 500 million years ago trying to figure out what the sun is? Jack brought up another question. Why is it me that exists only in my dreams that are changing the past? Why isn't it me physically going back in time? T thought about it for a second and replied, maybe your dream is how entanglement is communicated throughout time. It would be similar to the two entangled electrons spinning to the left at the same time when they are light years apart. Somehow they communicate without physically being connected. You are not physically connected to the past, but you are able to communicate somehow through your dreams. I wonder if there are beings from the future that come back to our present and make changes. There is no reason why that cannot happen. Jack shook his head and looked at T and then said, you do realize we sound like a couple of nut jobs? T replied, I think we are only scratching the surface. I have read where people believe our dreams transmit information into what's known as the common collective, a repository of all of the reality's actions. Delia Sullivan was a native of Sunbury, where she lived for all of her 53 years. Coming from the O'Malley family meant that she had many ties to the community that would keep an octopus busy tying knots. She had been working at Pinnacle for 10 years before Jack was hired, and she helped Jack get up to speed quickly in his new job. Jack and Delia were eating sub sandwiches that Jack brought into the office. Jack asked Delia questions about Sunbury back in its heyday. Delia, what was Sunbury like back when your great-grandfather was a sheriff? Delia swallowed her bite of sandwich and answered, back in 1910, it was a whole different world. Electricity was just beginning. Telephones were a luxury as were cars. People did not thrive. They survived if they had a little good luck, and if they didn't, then they lived the short, hard life. My great-grandfather was a big part of the Acre. It was a place where trouble was around every corner. There were probably 100, maybe 150 bars in Sunbury, and that was in a state where alcohol was illegal. There was gambling, prostitution, and an ample supply of people eager to participate. My great-grandfather ran his corner where you could get booze and poker, but he never had anything to do with the prostitutes. It's possible that they came into his bar, but he had nothing to do with them. Funny thing is, he was certainly not an angel, but he certainly was not Satan's disciple. Coming from Ireland, he had a certain respect for the Catholic Church. I don't think he was a regular churchgoer, but I also don't think he had a difficult time getting past St. Peter at the pearly gates. Jack asked Shannon O'Malley was his only daughter. Delia answered yes. She was his pride and joy for the 90 years he was alive. My grandmother had most of her children before she was 35, and then came my father. He was what the family called the miracle baby because he was born when my grandmother was 45 years old. That's what you call a surprise baby. Her husband, John Sullivan, went on a 3-day bender after he learned his wife was pregnant at 45. My grandmother Shannon lived to be 91, and she regrettably lived long enough to see my father die in a traffic accident when he was 35. Jack replied, that must have been hard losing your father at such a young age. Delia answered, you can say that again. My father was 35, my mother was 30, and I was 18. My mother died later that year from undiagnosed stage IV breast cancer. That was the year 1980. That year it was just me against the world. That year I would like to remove from my life. Jack replied, well, if it was Delia against the world, then I think Delia won. Delia said, I had a lot of people watching over me. When I was going to Sunbury High School, if there was a boy that was giving me a hard time, he only did it once and he usually lost his front teeth. All I want to remember is that year was horrible. I just worked at Tasty Freeze, and I just kept my head towards the grindstone. Jack picked T up at work because her car was in the shop. He walked into her office yawning, which prompted T to say, "Am I that boring?" Jack answered, "T, you are a thrill a minute. I'm just not sleeping well. Most nights I'm lying awake in bed until 3 a.m., and I have to get up at 6:30. T reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a CD and said, "Here, try this. It's what we give our clients during their training to deal with stress and anxiety. It's a CD to help you relieve stress. It plays the sound of waves crashing on a beach." Jack replied, "Does this mean I don't have to take you to Cancun this spring? We can just slap in the CD and run through the sprinkler?" T answered, "No, it means you can stay here and slap in the CD and run through the sprinkler. I'm going to Cancun to find some tall boy who is all man. That will rock my world." Jack replied, "It sounds like you have this all planned out. Maybe I should have a food tester." T replied, "Okay, now you made me feel guilty. I guess I'll let you be my towel boy." That night Jack listened to the CD when he went to bed. As far as he could tell, it was background noise, but with a little imagination he could convince himself that he was listening to ocean waves breaking on the beach. He fell asleep and for some reason had a dream about the terrible calamity that resulted in his mother's death and his father receiving burns. Jack was at his friend Ronnie Birch's house, where he had been for the last day ever since an ice storm shut down all of the roads. Their parents thought it best to stay put instead of dealing with the icy roads that had been covered with a 3-inch layer of ice. Once the roads were cleared, his parents would pick him up. The TV was on while Jack was eating breakfast with the Bircher family. He looked up from his bowl of frosted flakes and saw a reporter standing across the street from his house that was fully engulfed in flames. He dropped his spoon and ran to the TV anxiously, saying, "That's my house. That's my house. It's on fire. Where are my parents?" Mrs. Bircher called the police to let them know that Jack was at their house in case they were looking for him. She walked back into the living room and said, "Jack, the police don't have any information yet, but they were sending somebody over." An hour later, a police car pulled into the driveway and an officer came to the door. Jack took one look at his face and knew he did not want to know what the police officer had to say. The police officer had a sorrowful look on his face when he said, "I am sorry to tell you this, son, but your parents have been in a fire in your house that started about 4 a.m. when a tree branch fell onto the roof and knocked down the power line. The power line was lit and started a fire in the attic, which soon engulfed the entire house. I'm sorry to say your mother died in the fire and your father has been taken to the hospital suffering from burns and smoke inhalation. Due to the ice storm, it took the fire department longer than usual to respond, and by the time they arrived, the damage was already done." Jack woke up with his heart pounding in his chest, reliving the experience of being notified that his mother had died and his father survived with burns and lung damage was just as disturbing as the first time he heard it. Jack went to lunch with T the next day when he told her about his dream. "I used your CD last night to try and get some sleep." T asked, "Oh yeah, did it help?" Jack answered, "I'm sorry to say that it did." T was puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I thought you wanted to get some sleep." Jack replied, "I thought I did, but I sure could have had a different dream. The one I had last night was a dream about the policeman notifying me that my mother died in a fire and my father was severely burned. What a nightmare to relive that all over again." T replied, "Maybe there was a reason for you to have that dream." Jack asked, "What do you mean?" T answered, "Things happen for a reason, and for some reason that period in your life decided to make its presence known." Jack thought about T's last statement as he ate his club sandwich while looking at a large sailboat on the river. Then he had a thought appear in his mind and he said out loud, "Wouldn't it be something if I could warn my parents in one of my dreams?" T replied, "Why not? You did it before." Jack had been thinking about his conversation with T all day long. It was now time to go to bed and he figured he'd try the CD one more time because he knew he would need help shutting down his thoughts so that he could get some sleep. Slowly his mind began to shut down as the waves methodically washed them away. Jack found himself walking along the Kenduskeag stream down near where it empties into the Penobscot River. He wondered why the riverfront no longer had the manicured paths as he walked on the ground. An elderly man holding a cane made from an olive branch sat on the rock on the west bank of the Kenduskeag stream talking to a woman that looked to be 70 years old. The man stopped talking and stared at Jack as he approached them. He said, "Now there is a face I will never forget. You are Jack Lambert, I believe." Jack took a close look at the elderly man and realized it was Seamus O'Malley. Jack looked at the woman and could see a family resemblance. Jack said, "Hello, Seamus. Is this your daughter Shannon?" Seamus replied, "It sure is, thanks to you." Shannon spoke for the first time. "Is this the man who came to warn you about me?" Seamus answered, "Yes, it is. In the flesh, at least until he disappears into thin air. I have a bone to pick with you. Why isn't it that every time I see you, you haven't changed, but I get older? Hell, I am pushing 90 years old." Jack replied, "Seamus, I have no idea. All of this happens when I am sleeping. Seamus laughed while he said, "Do you mean to tell me I have been listening to a man sleepwalking?" Jack answered, "I'm afraid so." Seamus replied, "What brings you here today on this fine June day in 1970? Jack replied, "I need you to contact my parents who live at 24 Garland Street. I need you to tell them that on the 19th of February, 1988 there will be an ice storm that will knock down a tree and the electric line to their house, causing a fire. My mother died in that fire, and my father was severely burned. Please tell me you can warn them." Seamus listened to Jack and then he took off his hat and wiped his brow with a handkerchief. Then he said, "Jack, I cannot do this. I don't know why, but I know I'm not supposed to do this. By the time 1988 rolls around, I will no longer be here. I believe I must send my great-granddaughter to deliver the message." Dart. Jack went to work late the next day, showing up at 11 a.m. He came into the office and poured himself a cup of coffee, hoping it would clear his head. Delia came into his office and said, "Do you want to do lunch? I am buying. Call it your birthday lunch. I know it's July and your birthday is in June, but better late than never, I always say." Jack replied, "Can we leave for lunch at 12:30? I have to do a few things first, but since I came in late, I have to get a few things in the mail before I go." Delia answered, "I can do 12:30. Oh, by the way, while I'm thinking about it, I think you need to add a blurb at the beginning of the video explaining how the city got its name. Include the story where the Reverend Seth Noble went to Boston to petition the state of Massachusetts to be incorporated as Sunbury. While waiting to present the petition in Boston, Reverend Noble began whistling one of his favorite tunes, Bangor, a Welsh hymn. When a court official asked Noble what his town wanted to be called, Noble had a brain fart and answered Bangor instead of Sunbury. Nobody knows why he didn't correct the court, and so the name Bangor has been the name ever since. After a 20-minute drive, Delia and Jack arrived at the restaurant. It was almost 1 o'clock when they walked into the restaurant and took a seat on the outdoor deck that overlooked the Penobscot River. It was a bright sunny day and Jack wished he had a pair of sunglasses. A few minutes later, 3 people walked up to the table. The sun was shining brightly behind the 3 newcomers, turning them into dark silhouettes. After a few seconds, Jack recognized T, but he didn't recognize the other 2 people she was standing with. Delia greeted the new arrivals. "I was wondering when you guys were going to show up. Harry, Julie, I'm glad you could make it. Why don't you grab a few chairs from another table? I think we can all squeeze in here." Jack sat at the table completely confused. He was staring at his parents, but how could he be staring at them? His mother died in a house fire 27 years earlier, but now she was standing in front of him with grey hair and 3 decades added to her face. He looked at his father, who no longer had any scars from the skin grafts on his head and neck that he received in the fire. Jack's eyes began to fill with tears just as this reality began to fill his consciousness. He stood up and walked over to his mother and hugged her and said, "God, it's good to see you." Then he turned and hugged his father, saying, "I don't know what's going on, but I am glad to see you. You haven't looked better." Jack heard a small commotion and looked over and saw T holding something that he did not see when the 3 of them came in. He shaded his eyes from the sun and saw that she was holding a baby, just as Delia said, "How is little Seamus doing? He's got 3 grandparents sitting at this table. I sure hope he's ready to be spoiled." "Jack, why don't you take Seamus from your pretty little wife and hand him over to me?" He looked into Jack's eyes and realized something was wrong and asked, "This is all new to you, isn't it?" Jack answered yes. Delia heard T's question to Jack. She always believed this day would come and asked, "What's the last thing you remember?" Jack replied, looking at T, "My dream. I asked Seamus to warn my parents about the fire. He said he would have his great-granddaughter contact them and warn them. Then I woke up this morning, and now I'm at lunch with the 5 of you." Julie spoke. "Jack, when Delia knocked on our door 27 years ago with a strange message from her great-grandfather, well, we didn't know what to think. Delia said he made her promise 10 years earlier to come and warn us about a fire that would burn down our house and kill me. Then she said a man named Jack Lambert was the person who asked her great-grandfather to warn us. Well, that got me to look real close at Delia, and then I recognized her as the pregnant schoolgirl I gave advice to 10 years earlier. Well, everything began to fall into place. It didn't take long for us to realize that her baby boy was a you. Then a few days later the ice storm hit Bangor just as Delia said it would, and sure enough, the tree branch fell and hit the electrical wires. Your father stayed awake and called the fire department, and they arrived just as the fire began. They put it out, and nobody was killed or injured. I don't think any of us truly understands what has been going on, but I think finally, everything is as it should be. Now let's have some lunch. I'm starving." We can fill you in on everything that you have missed in the last 27 years of, what do I call it? Then she settled on a new course direction. My God, isn't this exciting? Reality is fickle. Not until observing an actual event that finally trumps all of the potential outcomes leading up to that event, does reality actually exist. That is, of course, unless you are from the devil's half acre. Then the flow of reality's events finds a way to correct its course.